Okay. So my presentation is on response to intervention, which is a tiered look at performance interventions in schools. So before we really get into it, just to quickly define what response to intervention is. It is a multi-tiered approach to early identification and support of students with learning and behavior needs. That's as defined by the Response to Intervention Action Network. An oversimplification of RTI is essentially the process in which we determine if students need to go to special ed, but before that, then just sort of looking if they need any additional adjustments before being recommended to special education services. So there are 3 tiers, and tier 1 starts with all students. So as you can see, it says 100% of students there. And what that means then is that all students will get some sort of baseline assignment or instruction to figure out if students are lacking in any sort of curriculum development, any sort of educational growth. RTI is based on student data for academic performance. And so essentially when you look at just the grades of a student, the interventions are then scheduled and placed based on whatever those formal assessments may or may not be. And then those interventions are typically conducted in the main classroom before escalation to tier 2. So what that typically means is that you're seeing teachers proctor these interventions before, and then giving their input to if a student needs to be escalated to tier 2. Okay. So what works? And that's that identification early in the student's career can produce really positive long-term results. So if a student is having an issue and it can be caught early, that student is very likely to have a high success rate in school. It is a student-focused strategy that can be successful with the right help. So it really is looking at what is best for the student, what's really going to help them out and get them to the level of achievement that they need. It's quick and efficient. So because Tier 1 can often be implemented by the teachers, this means that you can essentially test and assess students on a wide scale so that you can quickly get results out and figure what you need to do with that. And then if it is administered correctly, response intervention is often successful. And so at that point, then you see students that are in Tier 2 that will typically move back to Tier 1 as opposed to being escalated to Tier 3, which is really sort of the success that we're looking for when we use response to intervention. So what doesn't work? One of the biggest things here is that there's no federal standardization for the screener questions that are used in response to intervention to identify if a student needs any sort of intervention. And that makes it difficult because it is a one-size-does-not-fit-all program or problem. And so with RTI, you typically are getting questions that aren't very broad. What they do is they oversimplify the needs of the student down to just really simple questions. And so what that does then is it takes out the context of the student, which could be the culture that I have listed there underneath, but also what's going on in their life, what is happening socially, what's happening behaviorally, are there any sort of mental disabilities that they're dealing with? The screener questions don't typically acknowledge these sorts of things, and so that can be a huge issue. These questions are typically too simple, and they're too simple for complex issues that students have. So if you have your complex issues need complex testing in order to actually assess what needs to be assessed, right? If a student is having issues in math and in reading, you can't simply just give them a question that says, do you understand what 2 plus 2 is? Because that doesn't actually get to the point of, well, maybe they're having issues with number sense, or maybe they're having issues with picturing numbers that are written out as like the full word, right? Instead of just having the number 1, you see O-N-E to spell that out, and maybe a student can't visualize that as quickly as somebody else. In order to have complex testing, you need to have trained professionals. In order to have these trained professionals, that requires more money, and then if there's no money, then that's how you get more of the oversimplification of screener questions, and so then becomes a cycle like that. And the last major issue is that RTI is very reactive. It's not proactive, so that's why you're seeing the most movement in Tier 2 and not the most movement from Tier 1 to Tier 2 or from tier 3 back to tier 2. You're seeing it go out from tier 2. So that prompted me to sort of look at what's actually happening, and this is kind of moving on to task 3, where I did the literary analysis. In order for RTI to work, it requires an engaged and a diverse support team. So that means that everybody in that student's life needs to be working. They need to be aware of what the interventions are. They need to know the student. They need to know what's successful for the student. So that comes from main classroom teachers. That comes from a special education teacher if there's one involved. That comes from a social worker if there's one involved. That comes from para support if there's one, if there are any paras involved. And then it also mostly comes from the parents, who need to be involved in this too. Tier 1 is often being administered by teachers, as I've already mentioned, but Tier 2 is also being administered by teachers. And so what's happening then is those teachers typically don't have the training for Tier 2, or Tier 2 and Tier 3 are being done, that support is being done by special education teachers too, which then just ends up, I would say, you end up over-identifying students that end up needing these services, and then you stretch your special ed program very thin, and so you're not able to give the support that it should have, right? You don't want to have the special education overcrowded, and so that you lose the efficacy of that program. Many schools, depending on their funding, don't even have a Tier 3 level of support. So for those 5% of students that actually need this, they're not getting it in their school setting, which means that they typically have to go somewhere else, which is also very hard on a student's social development. And then also too, there's an issue, and that this happens typically in these schools that don't have money to even have a Tier 3 level of support, is that you're either getting culturally ignorant screening that over-identifies students of color, or you end up having a school situation that doesn't identify problems at all because they don't have the funding to do it. So either you're having students that aren't getting identified, or you're having too many students getting identified that don't need to be identified. There are other models of RTI. The big one we talked about in class was the multi-tiered support system, and that's very similar to RTI, but it gets more into the cultural context of the student, the social context of the student, the mental and emotional context of the student, and it takes much more time to produce results, but it does produce results. The other part of that, that's also another famous model that's under RTI, is also known as PBIS, or Positive Behavior Intervention System, which ends up then typically being sort of like a point system, and it works well for behavior, but it doesn't really address the needs of academic needs. So I actually interviewed a handful of people. The 4 of them here are, and I asked them these big 3 questions that are: what did you see? What do you see as the biggest successes of RTI? What do you see as the biggest failures of RTI? And then, was there anything else just sort of that when you worked with RTI that really sticks out to you? So my first one was a good friend of mine. His name is Tim. He's a 12th grade English teacher out in a very suburban school district. He enjoys the fact that there's no standardization to the screeners, because that allows him to be able to actually create his own screener questions and see where his students are at. And so this gives him a chance to put more effort into that Tier 1 level of intervention, and gives him the control over his classroom, so he doesn't have to escalate anything else out. If any students become a problem, that allows him to actually work well in the classroom and have a better understanding of that student. He has said that his administration has a hard time discerning behavior issues from academic issues. And that can then lead to academic punishment for behavior issues, which he is strongly against. By doing that, he says that you create a negative relationship with learning, which is the complete opposite of any teacher's goal. The next person I interviewed was another friend of mine who I used to work with. Her name is Decca. Decca works in a charter school whose demographic is primarily Somali, but is a high school special education teacher there. She really likes the fact that she doesn't think that Tier 1 is convoluted. She really thinks that it is, again, it kind of gives her that freedom to work her interventions to give her a better idea for what's going on. But she said that in general, families get shy, and they don't like to talk about what intervention means and what that means for their student. You look at that as sort of a failure and from the eyes of the parents, even though it's not, right? We want to present it as such that it's a means to help, and it's a means that everybody needs help from one time to another. But then she also mentioned that once you get past tier 1, there isn't a ton of support for tier 2 and tier 3. Again, going back to the fact that some schools don't have a tier 3, and then also that if tier 2 is an escalation of tier 1 and you don't have the resources to take care of it, well, then you easily fast track a student to tier 3 too. Tier 3 as well, I should say. Okay. And then I also happen to know two personal colleagues of mine, one that I work with and one that's just another family friend, who are both Augsburg alumni from the special education program. Rachel is a middle school special education teacher who has worked in Columbia Heights, who has worked in Anoka and is now in another suburban school district, so she's kind of been all over the place. She thinks there's too much of a focus on tier 2 and tier 3, and that juxtaposes what I was given, the information I was given from DECA. And I think that it's important to understand that when you have the funds to work with RTI, that a lot can be done at tier 1. And so it's important to focus on that. But she really didn't like the fact that RTI is reactive versus proactive, because it doesn't, again, that's why she stresses that you put all of that focus into tier 1, right? You don't ever really want to have the intervention. Assessments, of course, are important and needed and necessary in any sort of classroom setting, but you need to make sure that you're setting kids up with the tools for success so that when a major issue does come up, you know that student, you know the best plans of action to take care of that problem and have a resolution for it. And then Jacob, who is a coworker, he's a special education teacher in the building that I work in, and I've had a chance to work with some of the students on his caseload. He specifically works with EBD. He thinks that in our district there isn't enough implementation of it to actually be successful. We don't have a tier 3 support at our school, but he also says that we mostly focus on elementary school and middle school. And so that by the time these students who are so used to having these structures and routines in their day get to high school, they no longer have these. And so that sets up a whole nother range of issues for these students to deal with. What happens then is we see these kids lash out, for lack of a better term, or they just end up having some sort of behavior because their whole world has been flipped upside down. And Jacob stressed that all of a sudden you're seeing these kids that were just fine in a classroom setting all of a sudden have some sort of behavior disability, and he doesn't agree with that. He doesn't think that that is a fair assessment of the kids, but then all of a sudden now they get placed in a program that says that they need more support when in actuality they just need their structure and routine to come back. So my recommendations for strengthening RTI are going to be the fact that evidence-based research, which is used for RTI and RTI heavily relies on this, it needs to be focused on the context of the students. Whether or not those questions are standardized, those screens are standardized, they need to be relevant to the student. They need to be relevant to the student's community, to their culture, to their social context. All of those things need to be taken into effect when you are really looking at what the best solution is for a student. This can be done by having more specialized training, but in order to have that, you also need more funding. And that's just a matter of so many issues in the education world, as we all know, right? Without funding, you can't have the opportunity to try things. And so we need to make sure that if these students just need a slight variation in their day, rather than a whole special education programming for them, that we need to make sure that we are not actually just like over-identifying these kids for solutions and services they don't need. And then the last thing I think too is that we just need to really focus on what the academics are versus the social demands. With that, we really don't have, again, kind of as my interview with Tim stressed, right? You can't have an academic consequence for a behavioral problem. We need to make sure that the social factor, the social influences that are being a factor on our students are manageable, and that students have strategies to manage them, so they're not feeling stressed, or that they're not having these hard days so that they can focus on the intervention-based assignment that they are given if those are happening. So, that's my presentation. Thank you.